In this video, we will look at some examples of ethical challenges that you might encounter when doing qualitative research. First of all, let's look at informed consent. Because informed consent can seem like a very simple rule to follow. You tell people about your research, and then you get their agreement or consent to interview or observe them. But even seemingly simple rules can be more complicated in practice. First of all, what about indirect or hidden pressure? What if people consent to participate in your research because of pressure? Maybe they were recruited through a gatekeeper, someone who helped you get in touch with research participants. For instance, a teacher, if you are interviewing students or pupils in school. And then these people you are interviewing or observing feel pressure to say yes because they want to stay on good terms with the gatekeeper. How do you balance your need to recruit research participants and maybe using a gatekeeper to do that, and making sure that the consent you get is informed and totally free from pressure? That's a potential dilemma. Secondly, how much information should you give when you inform people about your research? Because too much information can be simply overwhelming. And in a qualitative research project, the focus of your project may be adjusted as the research proceeds. You start with some research questions, and then you might end up with slightly different research questions. And when consent is given, you don't know exactly which course the research project will take. How do you deal with informed consent in that case? And how do you know that people understand what it means to participate in a research project, that they actually know what they're consenting to? That can be a challenge. And participants might not care too much about research ethics, but even if they don't care, it's still your task to care. It's still your task to inform them and to make sure that they know what they're consenting to. In some cases, too much information can influence people's behavior or people's answers. So you need to strike a balance between being honest, but at the same time not giving too much information so that the interviews or the observation is shaped too much by what people know before the actual data collection. A third point relates to covert versus overt observation. Covert observation means that the researcher's identity is hidden. And according to the guidelines for research ethics, you should always obtain informed consent. And that means to do overt or open observation. The exception is when you do observation in public places. But even if you should obtain informed consent, how do you make sure that everyone you observe is actually informed and has consented? Because this can be particularly challenging if you're observing in a social setting where there's a lot of people present, you do not know beforehand who will be present. How do you then inform and have people consent to being observed? This could be if you're participating and observing at a larger meeting, or it can be if you're observing a church service. That it can be practically difficult to obtain informed consent. Oops, sorry. A fourth challenge relates to oral versus written consent, because consent is usually obtained in written form by having participants sign a consent form, and then you know that they have consented. And this consent form usually is connected to a written information sheet that details information about your project that you might give people, and then you might also inform them about your project orally. But in some cases, you will have to obtain consent orally. Could be that if your research participants are illiterate, it's not possible for them to sign a consent form. But there might also be cases where you risk putting your participants in danger if you have them sign a consent form that you will then carry around. If you're doing research on people who are persecuted, people who are oppressed by local or national authorities, written consent might put your your research participants in danger. Lastly, related to informed consent, what about payment? Does paying or compensating your research participant challenge their free consent? Sometimes participants may expect that you can somehow help them. In some disciplines, such as psychology, payment is more common. It's less common in other disciplines. And the reason for that is that if you pay your participants, there's a danger that people consent just because of the money. And there's also a danger if you're in a local community and you pay some people to be part of your research because they meet certain criteria, whereas others do not meet these criteria. And especially if it's a more marginalized community, there's a danger that your presence there creates additional inequalities because some people receive payment whereas others do not. At the same time, participants offer their time to be part of your research, and you get your data, you get what you need to write your thesis, to get your degree. What do the research participant get back? Maybe offering payment in cash is not the solution. Maybe buying lunch, coffee, or giving something back to the local community that everyone can benefit from, whether it's books for the local school or something else. Maybe that can be a solution. Depending on your context, you have to think about how to deal with the issue of payment. Special rules also apply when you are using data collected on the internet, and whether you need to obtain informed consent or not in this case depends on what kind of information you are collecting. If the information you are collecting is understood as public, such as newspaper or magazine articles, you do not need to obtain consent from the journalist or writer in order to do a textual analysis of these texts. But if you're collecting social media content, such as blog text, forum post, Facebook post, whether on an open page or in a group, Twitter post, etc., then the rules are a bit different. And to decide whether you need to obtain consent in those cases, because that really depends on whether this information should be defined or understood as public or private, you should check the Guide to Internet Research Ethics published by the Norwegian National Committees for Research Ethics. I will not go into all the details here, but this guide kind of gives you some terms to help you think through and decide whether the kind of text that you are collecting should be defined as public or private. So that was informed consent, but there's also quite a few challenges related to anonymization. First of all, how do you anonymize? Because your aim when making research participant anonymous is to avoid that they can be recognized by others. And this is usually done by not using people's real name, but by giving them a pseudonym or a false name instead. And sometimes you might also need to anonymize not only the participant's name, but also the name of a school, an organization, an institution, or a place where you have conducted your research. In addition, you might need to leave out or change background information that can make a participant identifiable, such as age, gender, occupation, where they live, or other details. And if you leave out or change this information, you should always specify it in the method chapter of your thesis to write exactly what have you left out, what kind of information have you changed, and if you change information, of course you have to make sure that you don't change information in a way that influences how your findings are understood. And when transcribing interviews, you might also have to avoid quotes with dialect or special expression, because these expressions or dialect terms can be used to identify a participant. But then the dilemma arises, because in order to make your analysis and findings as transparent as possible for the reader, you might want to give as much information about your research participants as possible. But in terms of research ethics, you might need to hide a lot of this information from the reader. And you therefore have to find a way to balance between being transparent, helping the reader to understand where the findings come from, and staying within the research ethical guidelines that you need to take care of. And this really, there's no one size fits all rules here, because it depends on your topic, depends on what kind of participants you have, or how sensitive the topic is, how easy it is to identify the research participants based on the background information you're giving. Maybe there's only one female working at a workplace, then revealing the gender of a person is something that can be used to identify the person. But maybe that's not a big issue, and you can include gender as a background information in your published thesis. Then the question is, who should you anonymize? Because ordinary people are usually anonymized, whereas public figures, it could be a politician, it could be the leader of an organization, are sometimes anonymized, sometimes not. And this decision of whether to anonymize or not depends on your research topic. It depends on the potential consequences of making the person identifiable, and it depends also on whether the participant was promised anonymity or not when consent was given. And again, sometimes you need to anonymize people even if the participants themselves are not so concerned about anonymization, because they might not see the full consequences of being identifiable in your research. Lastly, is complete anonymization even possible? Because that would mean that no one, not even yourself, can identify a participant, which is difficult or even impossible in qualitative research. But you should think about who can recognize the informant. What about gatekeepers who helped you recruit informants? Can they identify your research participants? Can participants identify each other? Can people with knowledge about the setting or the place where you conducted your research, can they, based on the background information you give, identify the participants? And is that a problem or not? And how do you then deal with confidentiality and anonymization in a group interview, a focus group, where there are other research participants present, or in an observation setting where you're not having a one-to-one relationship with the research participants? Additionally, your positionality and the power relations between yourself as a researcher and the participants can also be a source of research ethical challenges. How do you balance closeness and distance to the research participants? Is it okay to become friends with people? Or would that mean a potential conflict of interest between your identity as a friend and your identity as a researcher? In terms of interviews, there's quite a few challenges related to what kind of questions you ask and what kind of responses you get. Are there certain questions that are off limits? What if people share information they later regret telling you? How should you react if people express racist or sexist opinions? How do you react if people contradict themselves in an interview? In this video, we have looked at some ethical challenges you might encounter. The aim is not to list every challenge you might face, but to get you thinking about research ethics. And when you plan your master thesis and when you conduct the research for your thesis, you should reflect on research ethics all along. And remember, if you face a dilemma or a challenge and you do not know how to solve it, use your supervisor. Your supervisor is there to help you think through how to deal with these challenges. Good luck doing your research in an ethically sound way.